Arranging the hem on a garment when you're upcycling clothes is probably the most common technique that you will use, and it also has a pretty big impact on the final look. Now, there are a ton of different ways to hem a garment. It's going to depend on your fabric type, the final look that you are going for. It will sometimes be impacted by the construction of the garment, but today I'm just going to talk about the single fold hem and a double fold hem, and I'll show you how to do it. Here is my piece of sample fabric that I'm going to be working with today, and we are going to start with the single fold hem. One of my most important tips for when you are working with garments is to use an iron. It will really take your garments from looking homemade to looking professional. Just pretend this is the bottom of a dress here and it's got this raw edge because I cut a bunch of length off. A single fold hem is simply taking that edge of fabric and turning it to the inside, the wrong side of your fabric, and then you are going to simply stitch that down. Now here you can see, if this was a fabric that unraveled quite easily, which this is linen slub, so it does, you can already see it starting to come apart. I need to actually finish this edge so that it doesn't unravel before I sew that hem. And you have two options to do this. If you have a serger, which if you're a beginner, you might not, you can use a serger to finish off this edge. And if you don't have a serger, you can simply use a zigzag stitch on your machine. So I'm going to serge this real quick. And that is what that looks like. It's kind of hard to see with the light thread, but now that I have this edge finished, it's time to decide how wide I would like my hem to be. And that's going to depend on where you want that stitch line to fall, how far you want it to be from the edge. But just for the sake of this sample, most times you are going to be folding to the inside of the fabric, right? So that way this seam is concealed on the inside. If I wanted a really tiny, narrow hem, I'd probably just fold it up, whatever, 3/8 of an inch and pin. But if I wanted a wider hem, could fold it up to 1 inch. And you would see how that would impact the design of your garment, because if I pin this here at a wider seam allowance, I stitch that down, you can see with my pins that it would put the stitch line this far from the hem edge. And honestly, that is just fine. A lot of garments have that built in as a design feature, but really it just depends on what you want to do. Or you could work with a really small seam allowance. Just remember, whatever seam allowance you pick is going to impact the final length of your garment. And here you can see with my pins that it would bring that stitch line way closer down. So let me give that a stitch. And when you're working on a hem, you will want to backstitch. And backstitch is when you use the reverse stitch on your machine and you stitch back and forth over your stitches, and that helps lock in the beginning and the end. So I'm gonna go a few stitches forward, and now I'm gonna go hitting reverse a few stitches backward. And now I'm going to sew the duration of this, and that's really gonna help keep my stitches from coming undone. Now I've reached the end, so it's time to backstitch again. I'm going to reverse stitch a few stitches, and I just like to go a little bit back and forth. And now I have a nice flush finished edge that is not going to unravel. So now let's talk about a double fold. Let's say you are using a really delicate fabric, or you don't want to finish this edge, this raw edge, by using a serger or a zigzag stitch for some reason. You do have the option to fold this twice. So what you would first do is, using a smaller seam allowance, right? Because you don't want to take up a bunch of length of the garment, is you would want to fold maybe 1/8 of an inch or 3/8 of an inch up, and you'd want to give that a good press. So here you can see I've given this a pretty good pressing to the inside. And pressing is important because it just makes it way easier to handle this garment, because the next part, the next step of a double fold hem, you actually have to fold the fabric one more time, and that is what conceals the raw edge. And if I didn't press this, and I'm actually gonna press this one more time before I sew, because that just helps ensure that I get a really professional look and that things aren't crooked and bubbling weird. So I've just come back from my iron, and here you can see everything's laying much more neatly. So now I'm gonna do the exact same thing that I did with the first hem, and I'm just gonna sew a straight stitch across. And again, you can always use, depending on your measurement, the edge of your presser foot to keep things in line. And now you can see I have a beautiful clean hem on the inside. This does look a little bit more neat than say a single fold with a serge, but I do this seam all the time and I haven't had any problems with it. But again, it really just depends on the fabric. And this method would be the same if you were working with a dress or a t-shirt. The only time it gets a little crazy is when you're working with fabrics that are on a curve. You might need to use a different method. But again, as long as you're using your pins and you are pressing and taking your time, you should be able to make pretty much everything work. That's it for this technique. If you have any questions on any other hemming techniques, be sure to leave a comment below.